The finest cavalry force of the Iron Age was broken not by superior weapons, but by the pungent smell of pack animals. The Lydian elite lancers were considered entirely invincible, heavily armored horsemen who dominated the wide plains of Asia Minor with absolute authority. How could a humble beast of burden completely collapse the premier military power of the ancient Mediterranean? Today, we step into the suffocating dust of 547 BC to unmask the brilliant, desperate deception orchestrated at the Battle of Thymbra. Confirm receipt with a like to support our next historical decryption, and subscribe to join our analysis network. The strategic chessboard of the ancient Near East was ruled by rigid seasonal cycles. Ancient armies fought in the dry summer and retreated when the snows arrived. Croesus, the fabulously wealthy ruler of the Lydian Empire, followed this doctrine perfectly. After fighting the invading Persian forces to a bloody, unresolved standstill at the Battle of Thymbra, Croesus withdrew his massive army westward to his capital at Sardis. Winter was closing in rapidly. Assuming the campaigning season was over, the Lydian monarch dismissed his expensive allied mercenaries and sent his native troops to winter quarters. He believed he had bought enough time to assemble an overwhelming coalition army in the spring. He severely underestimated the audacity of his opponent. Cyrus the Great recognized a fleeting operational window. Instead of retreating to friendly territory, the Persian ruler ordered his battered army to execute a grueling force march across the freezing, unforgiving Anatolian plateau. This was a logistical nightmare. Supply lines stretched to their breaking point over treacherous mountain passes. Draft animals collapsed from exhaustion and bitter cold. The Persian and Median infantry marched on half rations, pushing their bodies through freezing winds to maintain an unrelenting pace. They advanced hundreds of miles outside the recognized boundaries of seasonal warfare. By the time Cyrus descended into the Hermus River Valley, he had achieved absolute strategic surprise. The Persian army arrived practically at the gates of Sardis before Croesus even realized the campaign had resumed. The Lydian monarch was caught entirely off guard. Yet Croesus did not panic. He rapidly mobilized his native Lydian forces, recalling every available heavy cavalryman from the immediate surrounding plains. He also integrated his remaining steadfast allies, including a formidable contingent of Egyptian heavy infantry. He marched out to meet the exhausted Persian army on the plain of Thymbra. This was flat, expansive alluvial ground. It was the absolute worst possible terrain for an outnumbered infantry force to fight upon, and the absolute perfect environment for a massive cavalry engagement. Cyrus had marched hundreds of miles to force a decisive battle, but now he found himself staring down a superior, heavily armored host on their home turf. The Lydian army deployed into a massive, extended crescent formation. The formation was designed to utilize numerical superiority, wrapping around both flanks of the smaller Persian force to crush them in a devastating double envelopment. At the tips of this sweeping crescent stood the true terror of the ancient world, the Lydian heavy lancers. These cavalrymen rode massive, powerful horses, bred specifically to carry men armored in thick bronze cuirasses and heavy greaves. They wielded long, perfectly balanced thrusting spears designed to shatter infantry lines upon impact. Facing this vast, overlapping crescent, Char_01 realized that a traditional linear deployment would equal immediate annihilation. The Persian command structure recognized the fatal danger of their position. They needed a formation capable of absorbing an envelopment without losing internal cohesion. Char_01 organized his forces into a deep, heavily reinforced hollow square, though some historical interpretations suggest a deeply modified line with massive refused flanks. At the very front stood the Persian archers and the Sparobara, the traditional infantry who carried large rectangular wicker shields. Behind them stood deeper ranks of infantry and dismounted cavalrymen. To secure the rear and prevent an absolute encirclement from becoming a slaughter, Char_01 positioned his tall, mobile siege towers. These wooden structures were dragged onto the field to serve as static firing platforms, providing an elevated overwatch that could shower the advancing Lydians with arrows and javelins. He placed the vulnerable baggage train inside this fortified perimeter. The Lydian wings began to accelerate. The ground literally trembled beneath the synchronized gallop of thousands of armored horses. The physical mechanics of a heavy cavalry charge depend entirely on managing momentum and unit spacing. The Lydian riders had to maintain a tight enough density to generate a crushing physical impact against the Persian infantry, but retain enough spacing to prevent their horses from tripping over one another on the uneven plain. Dust plumed into the sky like a gathering storm. As the Lydian wings pushed forward to encircle the Persians, a massive gap inevitably opened in the center of their extended crescent. Into this gap marched the Egyptian heavy infantry, hired allies of Lydia. These men operated under a completely different tactical doctrine than the mobile Persian infantry.
The
Egyptians fought in deep, tightly packed blocks.
This isometric view highlights the sheer.
They carried massive wooden shields that covered them from chin to ankle, creating a virtually impenetrable moving wall of timber and hide. They held long spears, stepping in perfect unison, aiming to batter their way directly through the Persian center. The physical collision in the center was deafening. Bronze met wicker. The Persian Sparobara planted their large shields into the dirt, attempting to brace against the sheer physical weight of the Egyptian advance. Arrow volleys rained down from the Persian rear. The composite bows delivered terrifying kinetic energy, but the Egyptian shields absorbed the impacts beautifully. Wood splintered. The Persian line bent backward. The mechanics of the Egyptian bloc relied on deep ranks physically pressing against the men in front of them, a brutal displacement of mass that forced the lighter Persian infantry to yield ground. The internal pressure within the center ranks was immense. Lungs burned for oxygen. Men were crushed against their own comrades as the Egyptian phalanx-like formation ground forward relentlessly. The Persian center was buckling under the enormous strain, fighting desperately just to survive the sheer kinetic push. At the same time, the Lydian cavalry on the wings reached their final galloping speed. The thunder of hooves drowned out the screams of the dying. The Persian flanks braced for an impact that would surely shatter their lines and end the empire. How do you evaluate this commander's decision to risk his entire army against such overwhelming cavalry superiority? The battle was seconds away from a catastrophic Persian defeat. Then it broke. Char_03, one of Char_01's most trusted Median generals, had proposed a radically desperate countermeasure just moments before the battle commenced. He recognized that no wall of wicker could stop the momentum of a Lydian heavy horse. But Char_03 understood something fundamental about equine sensory perception. Horses are incredibly sensitive prey animals that rely heavily on scent and sight to detect danger. They are easily terrified by the unfamiliar. At the command of Char_03, the Persian baggage camels were rapidly stripped of their heavy supply loads. Their riders were handed weapons, and these ungainly pack animals were forcefully driven to the very front lines of the Persian flanks, directly into the path of the charging Lydian lancers. The Lydian cavalry closed the final distance. They lowered their heavy lances. And then, the scent hit the horses. The sharp, musky, profoundly alien odor of the camels washed over the Lydian cavalry lines in an invisible wave. Compounding the olfactory shock was the visual nightmare. As the dust parted, the Lydian horses did not see opposing cavalry. They saw towering, misshapen silhouettes with long necks and erratic gaits. The equine psychological response was instant, violent, and completely uncontrollable. The Lydian cavalry formation disintegrated in a matter of seconds. Panic cascaded through the tightly packed, galloping ranks. Horses reared violently onto their hind legs. They bucked wildly, desperate to flee the terrifying scent. Heavy riders were violently thrown from their saddles, crashing hard into the dust. The perfectly synchronized charge turned into a catastrophic, colliding pileup of bronze, flesh, and terrified animals. The sheer physical momentum of the entire Lydian flank simply vanished. The attack was utterly neutralized without a single spear being thrust. But the Lydians were professional killers. Even as their horses bolted from the field, the elite cavalrymen did not surrender. They dragged themselves up from the dirt. Encumbered by heavy riding armor that severely restricted their mobility on foot, they formed makeshift infantry lines and drew their secondary weapons. They charged the Persian flanks on foot. A brutal, grinding melee ensued. The Lydians fought with incredible ferocity, but the physics of combat had fundamentally shifted against them. Their armor exhausted them rapidly. They had lost their primary reach advantage. The Persian infantry, supported by their own cavalry, systematically outmaneuvered the grounded Lydians. The flanks of Char_02's great army began to collapse inward under the coordinated pressure. With the Lydian wings completely destroyed by the camel deception and subsequent infantry counterattack, the Persian flanks wheeled inward. They executed their own brutal envelopment, closing around the massive Egyptian bloc in the center. The Egyptians, who had successfully pushed the Persian center back to the very shadow of the mobile siege towers, suddenly realized they were completely surrounded. The Persian towers now fired directly down into the dense, exposed Egyptian ranks. Despite being encircled, the Egyptians fought fiercely, their massive shields protecting them from outright annihilation, but their operational position was hopelessly compromised. The Lydian army was broken. The survivors fled the battlefield in total disarray, desperately seeking the safety of the formidable walls of Sardis. The immediate tactical victory belonged to Char_01, but the strategic consequences echoed across centuries. Char_02 believed his capital could withstand any siege, but within 2 weeks, Persian mountaineers scaled an unguarded, seemingly impassable cliff face and breached the citadel. Sardis fell. _02 was captured. The immensely wealthy Lydian Empire was completely erased from the political map in a single campaign season. The geopolitical ripple effect of Thymbra was monumental. Char_01 now controlled the entirety of Asia Minor, pushing the borders of the newly forged Achaemenid Empire directly against the Greek city-states of the Ionian coast. This proximity would eventually ignite the Great Greco-Persian Wars decades later. More profoundly, the Battle of Thymbra established a vital military truth. Technological superiority and flawless formation momentum can be entirely unraveled by introducing sudden sensory friction and psychological chaos. The unbreakable Lydian charge was defeated by an understanding of animal biology and desperate tactical improvisation. What ancient campaign would you like to see next on this channel?